And so it's my pleasure today to introduce the topic and our speaker. The webinar today is going to focus on Angkor Thom in Cambodia, and we're going to be hearing, as always, some strategies, some tips about thinking about how we can reframe our survey classes or just ways that we can incorporate this into our survey classes. And our speaker today is Dr. Melody Rod-Ari, who is a professor at Loyola Marymount University, where she teaches a wide spectrum of courses on Asian art. I have no doubt there will be questions, and as always, if you could please put them in the Q&A versus the chat, we would appreciate it, and we will get to them after Melody is done sharing her talk. So thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to you, Melody.
All right. Hi, everyone. Can you guys hear me? Great. Thank you, Lauren, Stephen, and Beth, and to everyone who showed up today. I had convinced myself, and I said to Lauren that summer plus vaccines probably includes summer vacation and no Zoom. So I'm glad to have you guys here. So as Lauren had mentioned, today we're going to be talking about Angkor Thom. So just give me a moment while I share my screen with you. Get this open. All right, here we are. So Angkor Thom, translated from the Khmer means great city. And so some strategies in terms of thinking about how to teach this material. I personally teach this material in an upper division unit, and specifically on a course that is dedicated to the arts of Southeast Asia. But I think that this would be a great course or a great material that you could include on, for example, a survey dealing with world empires or a general survey on global art history as well. And so the way in which I want to tackle Angkor Thom today, but also in the ways that I tackle it in my classroom, is to really begin with, what is Angkor Thom? Because in some ways, we have the luxury or advantage in the sense that most of our students will not know what Angkor Thom is, and so they won't have preconceived notions of what they think it might be or what it might look like, or there's always the possibility as well that they've conflated it with another monument. So again, it's always important, I think, with dealing with Angkor Thom in setting out, well, what is it? So in my classes, I talk about Angkor Thom as first and foremost what it is. It's a planned royal city. From there, I go on to talk about its sacred and religious symbolism, which is that it is organized as a sacred mandala. And then lastly, I want to remind students that what we're seeing today, right, the images that we see, if they ever have the opportunity and good fortune to be able to visit the Angkor Archaeological Park, that what they see is very different from the lived experience of the monuments and the city of Angkor Thom itself in the height of the 13th century. And so the reason why, again, I lay out the introduction of Angkor Thom the way I do is there are some misconceptions about what Angkor Thom is for students or individuals who try to find some basic information on the web. So for example, a search on Google or any other type of search engine, if you Google Angkor Thom, oftentimes what will show up is actually information on Angkor Wat, right? And Angkor Wat is very different from Angkor Thom. First of all, Angkor Wat is a singular monument, right? It's a Hindu temple, and it's a temple that predates the city of Angkor Thom itself. So, first and foremost, it's a good reminder to tell our students that Angkor Thom is not a singular monument. It is in fact an entire city. It's a royal city. It does have important monuments and temples located within this royal city itself. Perhaps the most significant is the Bayon Temple, which you see here, and it's located at the center of Angkor Thom itself. So again, right, just to remind our students, Angkor Thom is not Angkor Wat because, just doing a simple search this morning what I found is when I Googled Angkor Thom, the first thing that came up was information on the Hindu temple of Angkor Wat. The city of Angkor Thom was developed under the patronage of King Jayavarman VII. And here you see a portrait sculpture of King Jayavarman VII himself. Now, Jayavarman ruled from 1181 to 1218. So 1218 marks the year of his death. We believe that he died sometime around his 80s. So that's actually a very long life expectancy during this particular time period in Cambodia. He actually came to the throne somewhat late in his life. He was in his 40s. The Angkorian Empire had undergone a series of wars, specifically with the Choms or the Champa kingdom in what is now modern day Vietnam. And Jayavarman VII was able to victor over the Choms and establish himself as the king of Cambodia and sort of redevelop the Angkorian Empire to greatness again. Jayavarman VII is important for a variety of reasons, perhaps one of which is that he was a Buddhist, right? He was a devout Buddhist. And for those of you who are somewhat familiar with Angkorian history, the majority of kings of the Angkorian Empire were Hindu. In fact, the first king of the Angkorian Empire was Hindu. And, the great King Suryavarman II, who was the patron of Angkor Wat, was also Hindu as well. So as a Buddhist, Jayavarman actually instituted Buddhism as the state religion of Angkor. So this is, again, very significant because up to this time, Hinduism largely played a large role in the political and religious life of elites in Angkor at this time. In terms of the type of Buddhism he practiced, scholars are not quite sure. We believe that he practiced a form of Mahayana Buddhism that's, again, it's not entirely understood. But again, it derives from Mahayana Buddhism, and there seems to be a cult centered around his personality. And you'll get a sense of this as we move through today's webinar. I recognize right now that I'm throwing out a lot of terms that you might not be familiar with, and certainly that your students might not be familiar with. So I actually have given Lauren a term sheet of a lot of the terms that are being used in this webinar, but also that would be helpful for teaching Angkor Thom. So please make sure to access that as well. In terms of Angkor Thom itself and rule by Jayavarman VII, it really marks the last great period of Angkorian rule. After the death of Jayavarman VII, there's a steady decline in the power of Angkor. Part of this has to do with his own personal charisma. Charisma is incredibly important to leadership in Angkor at this time, in much of South and Southeast Asia as well, but also because of the rise of other kingdoms in Southeast Asia, principally the Siamese in what is now modern day Thailand. In terms of Jayavarman VII's legacy, in addition to instituting Buddhism as a state religion, he's remembered for his public works, which includes the building of numerous hospitals, schools, and temples. In terms of all of the Angkorian kings from the 9th to the 15th century, what we can say is that Jayavarman VII was probably the most ambitious of all the patrons. More monuments and structures and buildings were built under his reign than any other king. And so inscriptions tell us that the reason why this is so is because he saw himself as a great Buddhist ruler, and that he was building these structures and monuments and infrastructure like hospitals and schools in order to alleviate the suffering of his people, right? And, this reminds me, it's a good point to remind you, but also our students, that much of what we know about Angkor at this time in the 13th century comes from these royal inscriptions in stone. And so, they oftentimes tell us the the great generosity of the king. They also provide information on royal and religious edicts, but they really don't tell us much about life for everyday people in Angkor. Now, it's certainly possible that writings were executed on most likely, palm leaf at this time, but those materials have since disintegrated. So what we have left in terms of documentation, written documentation, are these royal stone steles. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to talk about Angkor Thom in terms of the three themes that I've laid out at the very beginning. So again, Angkor Thom is first and foremost a planned royal city, right? Again, it was built by Jayavarman VII. Translated from the Khmer, it means great city, and it very much so is a great city. The royal city itself was built around and on top of existing monuments. So when you look at images of some of the monuments and temples from Angkor Thom, you'll notice that they are not perhaps as structurally sound as some other monuments that were built during the Angkorian period. And, part of this has to do with the fact that it was built on, former monuments, right? So that the ground itself wasn't as stable. Other reasons is that because there was so much building taking place during Jayavarman VII's reign, there were some shortcuts, if you will, that were taken in the building of some of the structures. Now, the enclosed city itself is approximately 900 hectares, and the city walls that help to delineate the space, right, that sort of demarcate this royal space, are roughly about 26 feet high. The city is surrounded by a moat. So that blue outline that you see here on the slide is representative of that moat, known as a beret. Now, the moat serves a variety of functions, right? It's first and foremost, it provides for protection. It also provides for irrigation of the city. But what we'll discuss momentarily is that it also provides, a connection to symbolism within, the Buddhist cosmos. In addition to, the planning of the city, what we have are 5 causeways that leads to the royal city. So that's the red lines that you see on this slide. So the red lines represent the causeways, or bridges, if you will, that one must traverse in order to enter the city, but also get to the heart of the city, which is the Bayon Temple, which is located in the center. Now, there are 5 causeways. 4 of them are at the 4 cardinal directions, and that there are 2 causeways on the eastern side. You'll notice that the eastern causeway leads directly to the Bayon Temple, whereas the second causeway leads to the royal palace. At the height of the reign of Jayavarman VII and during the height of Angkor Thom, it's believed that there were roughly 1 million people who lived in this royal city. So you might be asking yourself, and students always want to know, well, who lived in the royal city? Certainly it was the king, the royal family, also military and political officials, as well as priests and servants. Now today, all that remains of Angkor Thom are religious monuments and ceremonial structures, and that's because these are structures that are made out of stone. Residential structures, inclusive of the palace of King Jayavarman VII, was made entirely of wood. So these no longer remain. Just as an aside, what I try to, remind my students of that for much of history in Southeast Asia, residential structures were made out of wood, even for those of elites and the royal family. And that's because, the weather in Southeast Asia is very humid. It can be very hot and muggy. So wood really provides for breathability, right? It's also a material that is, readily available in this part of the world. It's not until the rise of colonialism and settler colonialism, where we have folks from Europe settling in Southeast Asia, that we begin to see residential spaces being made out of stone, brick and concrete. And that's because this is the fashion of Europeans, right, that then gets adopted by the elites in Southeast Asia. So again, prior to the height of colonialism, the majority of residential structures in Southeast Asia are made out of wood. And if you've ever been to Southeast Asia and were stuck in a stone building, you'll know that they're incredibly uncomfortable, particularly if there's no AC. So it's much smarter to have a wooden structure. At the heart of Angkor Thom, so again, this royal city, is the Bayon Temple. Now, among some of the responsibilities of any great Angkorian king, right, he was supposed to provide for his people. He was also supposed to build a religious structure and also monuments to his ancestors. So this is why whenever you have a new king, right, one of the first undertakings of their reign is to build a new religious monument. And this sort of sets the style and tone of their reign. And for Jayavarman VII, the Bayon Temple served this purpose. Now, we'll talk about the symbolism of the Bayon Temple being set in the middle of Angkor Thom in a moment, but I just want to give you a sense of what the Bayon Temple looks like. We know that the Bayon Temple is one that is dedicated to the Buddha. We know this because Jayavarman VII is Buddhist himself, but also because of the main icon that was housed in the temple. Now, all Indic temples, so Buddhist, Hindu, and Jain temples, typically in their most sacred sanctuary, hold their main icon. So in other words, the most important icon that is revered at this particular religious space. And at the Bayon, it is this larger than life-size image of a seated Buddha under a hooded naga, or a serpent king, that you see here. Now, during the time of use, we believe that this particular image would have been housed in the central sanctuary. If you were to go visit the Bayon Temple today, it is not there. It's been set off aside. It's placed in an outdoor pavilion where people can pay respect to it. It was actually rediscovered in the 1930s to be buried in a crypt in the central sanctuary. So at some point between the time of use of this temple and the 1930s, this particular sculpture was hidden away. Now, there have been some theories that the sculpture was hidden away because of iconoclasm towards Buddhism. After the death of Jayavarman VII, Angkor reverted back to Hinduism. However, scholars are revisiting that idea. There was a recent study that mentions that perhaps this sculpture of the Buddha remained in public view at the Bayon Temple up until the 15th century, and that it wasn't buried until about the 15th century. So, what I just want to lay out for you and for our students is that we know that this temple is a Buddhist temple first and foremost because of the iconography and the icon that is set within the most sacred space. Also at the Bayon Temple, and what makes it significant is that there's a lot of visual documentation. So while there isn't a lot of text that tells us how everyday people lived during the 13th century, we do have visual imagery that documents life at Angkor at this time. So we have images of royal and military processions, as you see here, that are in relief at the Bayon Temple, but we also have images of everyday life. So at the center of this particular relief that I'm showing you, you can see in the central pavilion, right, this outdoor pavilion, you see some women. And so in fact, what's happening here is you see a woman who is in the middle of childbirth. You see that her thigh and leg have been sort of tied together with some sort of textile or rope in order to help her in the birthing process. You see her being coached by her midwives. So again, it's really this great visual document that gives us some indication of what life was like, how people dressed, what was au courant at this time, and certainly what the architecture, right, the wooden architecture looks like at this time period as well. In terms of some of the visual iconography at the Bayon Temple, but also in Angkor Thom, it's a bit of an enigma. So as you enter this great city of Angkor Thom, right, you are met with these towers that have 4 faces on them. So on the left slide, you see 2 of these face towers at the Bayon Temple, and then you see one of the entrance gates to the city of Angkor Thom. And they all include these 4-headed towers, right? Scholars are still in debate as to what this 4-faced image may represent. Some scholars argue that it may represent the Buddhist deity Avalokiteshvara, who is the bodhisattva of compassion. Others have argued that it may represent the pan-Indian deity Indra, who is the king of all gods. And so there are certainly, good arguments for both. I'm not going to try to answer the identity of the 4-faced towers today, but I think what we can conclusively say is that it certainly represents King Jayavarman the Seventh, right, as some sort of divine figure. You can see that the faces on the towers very much resemble the portrait sculptures of Jayavarman the Seventh himself, and this is not unusual. When you look at sculptures of deities from the Angkorian period, you should think of them as being portraits, perhaps idealized, of exalted patrons, right? So, if you are a patron or a craftsperson making an image of a god, you are most likely going to base that image on the most important person in society at that time period, which is the king. And certainly, kings of the Angkorian Empire styled themselves as Deva Rajas. So in other words, god kings. They were both political and religious powers. While we don't know the identity of those face towers, we do have some inkling of what Angkor Thom looked like at this time period. And I had mentioned earlier, I said, we don't have documents written by everyday people from the Angkorian period in the 13th century, but we do have accounts written by a Chinese emissary dated to 1296 that does give us a sense of what life was like at Angkor Thom and in the Angkorian Empire at this time period. And so there was a Chinese emissary that was sent to Cambodia in the 13th century. His name was Do Daguan, and he published his accounts of his trips to Cambodia, known as the Customs of Cambodia. And he writes, quote, "At the center of the kingdom rises a golden tower." So this makes reference to the Bayon Temple, flanked by more than 20 lesser towers and several hundred stone chambers. On the eastern side is a golden bridge guarded by 2 lions of gold, one on each side, and with 8 golden Buddhas spaced along the stone chambers. North of the golden tower rises the Tower of Bronze, another temple, the Bapuan, higher even than the golden tower, a truly astonishing spectacle with more than 10 chambers at its base. A quarter of a mile further north is the residence of the king. Rising above his private apartments is another tower of gold. These are the monuments which have caused merchants from overseas to speak so often of Cambodia, the rich and noble. And so I encourage you, if you were to teach Angkor Thom to your students, to make reference to some of Zhou's writings, because they really sort of bring to life this ancient city. He talks about royal processions where there are 500 female dancers, right, drenched in golden jewelry and with candles in their hands, banners and elephants parading through the causeways. Again, this really helps to enliven the temple and really put some perspective to Angkor Thom and the monuments that are there. I also want to point you to some resources. Again, I've given these to Lauren. There have been some really great um, technological advancements in the last 10 years that have made it possible to sort of reconstruct and sort of imagine what life was like during the Angkorian period. There is this great website that has been put together by scholars, archaeologists, museum curators, folks in academia called Virtual Angkor. So I encourage you to go there where you can literally guide your students through a tour and walk through Angkor and Angkor Wat and Angkor Thom as well. It's a great website. I also encourage you to direct your students and perhaps yourself to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian channel has produced some really great videos on reconstructing what some of these monuments look like. And so these images actually come from the Smithsonian channel. So you can see here a reconstruction of the King's Palace, which is made possible through descriptions of the palace that Joe has made, but also some of the materials found. So at the bottom, you see some of the wooden foundations that were from the palace itself. Now, moving along, right, Angkor Thom was not only a planned city, but it was a planned city that was always imagined as a sacred mandala. A mandala is a diagram of the universe. Now, this is a tool that is used by Indic religion. So this is not specific to Buddhists, right? We see mandalas being used by Hindus as well. And we really need to think of Angkor Thom as a mandala, in other words, as a microcosm of the universe. And the way that it's planned very much is designed to replicate the diagram of the universe. So, at the center of Angkor Thom, as I've mentioned, is the Bayon Temple. And the Bayon Temple, with its many towers, right, it's supposed to represent the peaks of Mount Meru. So Mount Meru is the home to the gods, to the deities. And Mount Meru is also imagined as this axis mundi that connects heaven to earth. The city walls, right, that those 26 feet city walls represent the continents and mountain ranges that surround Mount Meru, whereas the moat represents the cosmic oceans of the universe that also surround Mount Meru. The causeways, which we'll discuss in a moment in depth, refers to both Hindu cosmogonic myths as well as to Indra's heaven. So all of these aspects together help to imagine Angkor Thom as a sacred mandala, but also to imagine Angkor Thom as Mount Meru. So you might be asking yourself, well, why would Jayavarman VII want to do this? In fact, all of the monuments at Angkor Thom represent, all of the monuments of the Angkorian Empire, religious monuments that is, to a certain degree, right, represent Mount Meru, home of the gods. And for Jayavarman VII, it's quite ingenious because he's not only saying that the home of the gods is within his kingdom, right, but his capital city, his entire capital represents Mount Meru. And because he sees himself as a Buddha Raja, right, or a great Buddhist sovereign, he oversees this realm himself. All right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to get us to imagine ourselves traversing through and into Angkor Thom itself. So imagine yourself, right, visiting the city of Angkor Thom. You are walking across the causeway, so this bridge leading up to the gates to the royal city. So this is what this causeway looks like. This is what it looks like today, right? Unadorned, unpainted, ungilded. However, during the time of use, it would have looked completely different, right? You can imagine during time of use that these figures would have been gilded and painted. The face towers of the Garopa or the gateway certainly would have been gilded as well. There would have been banners, right? Fabulous textiles marking the entrance into the great royal city. Now, I want to draw your attention to the imagery on the causeways, and to give you a sense of how grand it is, right? This was a causeway meant to accommodate royal processions, right? And so you can imagine the king seated on an elephant, right, parading into his royal city. On either side of the causeways are 54 figures. So on the right side, there are 54 figures of devas, so gods, and on the left side are 54 asuras, or demon figures. They're in essence the foes of the devas. So in other words, 108 in total on each one of the causeways. So remember that there are 5 causeways in total. Now, the number 108 is very important, right? It is associated with victory. And we see this number being important throughout Indic religions and throughout different monuments of Angkor in general. This imagery of the devas and asuras pulling on a naga. So a naga is a serpent deity. So you can see that they're holding onto something. It kind of looks like a rope. It's in fact the body of the naga. And you can see at the terminus, the head of the naga itself. And so this imagery is associated with a couple of possibilities as it relates to Angkor Thom. The imagery of the devas and the asuras and the naga is oftentimes associated with a Hindu cosmogonic myth known as the churning of the ocean of milk. And what you're seeing here is the very well-known bas relief from Angkor Wat, which depicts this cosmogonic Hindu myth, which makes complete sense within the context of Angkor Wat, because it is a Hindu temple where you see the gods and the asuras working together in order to release the elixir of life. Now, this Hindu cosmogonic myth is somewhat perplexing within the context of a Buddhist city and a Buddhist monument, right, leading to a Buddhist monument. So this is just one theory, and certainly, there's a degree of religious tolerance that exists in Angkor at this time, and a lot of iconography that is being shared. So it's certainly a possibility, but it is, somewhat unusual, right? In terms of the imagery that this causeway may be referring to. Scholars have also argued that perhaps the causeways with the imageries of the Deva and the Asuras may represent the Rainbow Bridge, which connects heaven to earth, which does have a Buddhist narrative to it. Scholars have also argued that perhaps it represents the bridge leading and surrounding Indra's heavens. And the reason for the association with Indra is the fact that we do have stone stele inscriptions at Angkor Thom that make reference to Indra. So again, there are different possibilities as to what this imagery may represent at Angkor Thom. But, what I'm trying to sort of suggest here in sort of conveying all of these different theories and focusing on the causeways is just to remind us and our students that Angkor Thom is not just a royal city, but it is very much a mandala as well. It has both religious symbolism as well as being a very important political space. All right. And this slide is just to remind us and our students that this idea of the mandala is not unusual within the Angkorian context, right? We know that Angkor Wat, a singular temple dedicated to the Hindu god Vishnu, was imagined and visualized as Mount Meru and as a mandala. But the sort of genius of Angkor Thom is that the entire city is visualized as a mandala. Here's some imagery for you there. And then lastly, just briefly, I want to remind our students when we're teaching Angkor Thom that it's very much part of a World Heritage Site, right? So Angkor Thom is actually just one part of the Angkor Archaeological Park. And the monuments that we see at the archaeological park are very different from the lived experience of these monuments and the people who lived there during the time of use. What you're seeing here are two well-known temples that were built under Jayavarman in the 7th reign. They're not located within Angkor Thom itself, but I just wanted to include them. Top Prom is probably one of the most famous because it's been overtaken by these trees. I think it actually makes like a vignette in Tomb Raider, which I have yet to see. But Angkor Thom is again part of the Angkor Archaeological Park, which became a World Heritage Site in 1992. And the park includes monuments, hydraulic structures, ancient roads, and natural terrain that's significant to the Angkor period. And the park itself covers approximately 400 square kilometers. Now, in the same year that it became an archaeological park, it also was put on the list of World Heritage in danger. And it's in danger for a variety of reasons. It's in danger because of the terrain in which it lives and monuments not being structurally sound, but also it's in danger of looting and in danger to the tourists who come to the site and are not always respectful at all times. So I want to end my portion of the presentation of Angkor Thom here. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen right now.
Thank you so much, Melody. This was fantastic. And I feel like I could just have kept listening to you tell me all these wonderful things.
I'm sorry that it went a little bit over. I think it's just
okay.
A lot too.
It's okay. It's a huge city, as you have reminded us to remember that. And it makes complete sense that it would be longer than one single, something focused on a single object. So this was fantastic. And I learned a lot, and we have some great questions if you're okay with taking some.
Oh yeah, definitely.
So we had one question about the name of the temple at the center of the city. Does the name Bayon have significant meaning, and is that its original name?
It's making reference to Brahma. So it's making reference to like, a higher divine authority.
And so it is the original name of the temple.
It's like an abbreviated.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. And then we had another question about the stone. And this is also one that I was thinking about. Is the stone, is it all local, or did it come from farther away? And how is it transported to the site? And is it all the same stone? I mean, some of the stone that you were showing, and it could have just been the photographs. It almost looked like there were different types of stone being used. And so
the foundation of almost all Angkorian temples, particularly the large ones, are laterite. But the stones for the monuments itself are stones that are locally sourced, right? So they're coming from a distance, but they're not coming from like vast distances away. There's repositories of stone at Mount Kulen, for example. They were transported, we believe, they were hewn in large pieces and then transported on raft along rivers and then through canals to make it to different parts of the empire. Something that I didn't touch upon in the webinar is that one of the responsibilities of Angkorian kings was to provide for their peoples in terms of water, right? Water is incredibly important. And so that's where that imagery and association with Indra is so important, because Indra is not only the king of the gods, but he's also king of the rains. So you have to provide through water. So irrigation is really important. And so something that folks may not be aware of is that the Angkorian Empire is located very close to the Tonle Sap lake/river. And so what's interesting about this body of water is that during the monsoon season, it reverses course. Right. So when it's reversing its course, this allows the engineers, we think of engineers as being this very modern concept, but these ancient engineers to harvest those water and to put them in those barrays, those moats for later use, right?
Really
and so you're using those bodies of water to help move these large bodies of, these large chunks of stone in order to build these great monuments. I If I recall, because I'm trying to think of all the research sources that I've been looking at recently, Virtual Angkor has these really great videos and interactive images that show you how the stones were hewn and how they were, yeah, so they've done just a fantastic job, like how they were hewn, how they traveled to make their way to workshops. It's like fantastic. So I definitely encourage folks to go to Virtual Angkor. I want to say it's a .com. It might be a .org.
I'm excited to go. I have not actually navigated that or explored that, so I'm excited to go and dig deeper into that.
Yeah, and so, if you have the luxury, which I don't in my classrooms, to have VR technology, I don't know how many of us do, to allow your students to use that as they're viewing, because they can literally just move through the space. What I've done for my classes is that I've purchased those cardboard versions, and I've had them put their phones in the cardboard versions, which it's worked. So
yeah, I'm also a big fan of the Google Cardboard with the phone. And so for anyone who hasn't had the opportunity, they're very cheap, like $20.
I managed to find it for like $3.
Oh, so there you go. Even better. We have a couple of other questions. One is about, you mentioned how the city reverts to being Hindu after Jayavarman VII. And so does that suggest that there is a tension between Buddhism and Hinduism at that time?
I mean, I'm cautious to say that there's tension per se, right? Because I think in our sort of modern understanding of religion, we like, and the way that we teach as well, I know that it's very useful for me to say that this was a Buddhist period and this is a Hindu period, and this imagery is specifically Hindu and this is specifically Buddhist. But what we see at Angkor is that there's overlap, right? And because it's useful to appropriate and adopt imagery from Hindus. We see that with Jayavarman VII himself. The tension really lies in kings wanting to establish themselves and their rule, right? And the way in which they do that is to overtake previous imagery and previous territory of kings before them. So I think the real tension is between successors and predecessors, and much less against the religions and those practicing the religions.
That's an excellent way of framing it. Thank you for that. We also have another question about the reservoirs and the moats. And so the question is that, there's a practical function for the reservoirs and the moats in addition to the symbolic ones. And the water table of the land where the monuments were constructed were kept level by keeping the moats filled, which prevented the structures from sinking during the dry seasons. And is there truth to that? So someone has read that, and is that?
I am not a specialist of this at all, so I'm not going to try to answer that. There are lots of specialists of this, particularly archaeologists. So I'm not going to try to answer that.
Fair enough. Well, this was really wonderful, and we very much appreciate you taking the time to come and offer some strategies. And I'm already thinking about portraiture in this global context with what you were discussing earlier about Jayavarman. If folks have more questions for Melody, please feel free to post them in the Smart History Commons on Facebook, and she can answer them, or we can field them to her later. But for now, we'll say goodbye and thank you. And you're getting lots of thank yous in the Q&A and the chat, Melody. So
well, thank you. And I hope that the resources that I've sent you are helpful to folks. The term sheet I hope will be really helpful. You can always use it as like quizzes, right? I love doing that. Like define Devaraja. But it also gives you a breakdown of the different major Buddhist sects as well. So there's some information there.
Yeah, and thank you for sending those along. They'll be paired for anyone who is with us today or watching this. They'll be paired with the recorded video when we have it posted. So stay tuned for that. And for now, we'll say goodbye and thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye.